The Hotel from Hell. I discovered a small hotel called the Golden Quill, an inviting and agreeably old-fashioned name suggestive of sound literary craftsmanship and a restful night's sleep in a feather bed. I made my optimistic way into the gloomy lobby and across a strip of musty carpet to the reception desk where, when no one appeared, I rang a copper bell. It was cracked, and its discordant clangor filled the air. I turned, hoping to see some member of the staff hurrying towards me along one of the shadowy corridors that led off the lobby, but nobody came. Turning back to the counter, I was startled to find that the receptionist had materialized behind it like magic. He was a Merkholmer. I could tell from his pallid complexion. My knowledge of Merkholmers had been acquired from Sebag Siriosa's excellent novella on the subject, The Damp Denizens, and I had already encountered several of these rather weird Zemonian life forms in the streets.
"Yes,"
he said, sounding as if he was at his last gasp. "I'm, looking for a room?" I replied in a tremulous voice. 5 minutes later, I was bitterly regretting not having taken to my heels on the spot. My room, for which I had paid in advance at the receptionist's insistence, turned out to be a lumber room of the most appalling kind. With unerring misjudgment, I had settled on what was probably the worst overnight accommodation in Bookholm. Not a sign of a feather bed, just a coarse, prickly blanket on a mildewed mattress with something rustling inside it. To judge by the noise coming from the room next door, which was occupied by a family of Bloodums, their children were using the furniture as xylophones. The paper was peeling off the walls, and some creature was scampering around beneath the floorboards with a series of high-pitched squeaks. Dangling from the ceiling in an inaccessible corner, a white, one-eyed vampire bat seemed to be waiting for me to go to sleep so that it could begin its gruesome meal. Then I noticed that there were no curtains over the windows. The sun's merciless rays would be bound to shine in at 5 in the morning and prevent me from getting another wink, because the smallest glimmer of light prevents me from sleeping. I've eschewed slumber masks ever since I tried one out and forgot the next morning that I was wearing it. Panic-stricken in the belief that I'd gone blind overnight, I blundered around like a headless chicken, then tripped over a stool and landed so heavily that I dislocated my shoulder. I had no intention of spending the night at the hotel in any case. I was able to lay down my bundle at last and sluice off some of the dust from my travels with the brackish water in the wash-basin. That would do for the time being. Bookholm's antiquarian bookshops were open 24 hours a day. Hungry, thirsty, and itching to root around in their wares, I bade the bat and the Bloodums good night and hurried out into the bustling streets once more. Only a small proportion of Bookholm, barely 10% perhaps, is situated on the surface. By far the greater part of the city lies underground. Like some monstrous termite's nest, it consists of a system of subterranean tunnels that extends for many miles in the form of shafts, chasms, passages, and caverns entwined into one gigantic, unravelable knot. No one can say when or how this cave system came into being. Many authorities claim that it was indeed created by a race of prehistoric termites, huge primeval insects that constructed it as a nest in which to hide their gigantic eggs. The city's antiquarians, on the other hand, swear that the system of tunnels was excavated over thousands of years by many generations of booksellers as a place in which to store old stock. This is certainly true of some parts of the labyrinth, especially those situated close to the surface. Countless scholars have augmented this wealth of speculation with theories of their own. Personally, I favor a composite theory according to which the original system of tunnels was excavated by some form of prehistoric insect and then, over the millennia, enlarged by increasingly civilized creatures. The only certainty is that this subterranean world exists, that it has never been fully explored to this day, and that many parts of it are crammed with books that grow steadily older and more valuable the deeper into the catacombs one descends. There was nothing to remind me, as I strolled through the streets, of the labyrinth beneath the cobblestones. I was delighted to note that I would not have to go hungry in Bookholm. In addition to the coffee-houses and taverns, there were many stalls selling inexpensive fare of all kinds. Grilled sausages and stuffed poussins, bookworms baked in clay, fried mouse bladders, mulled ale, flying pancakes, roasted peanuts, cold lemonade. Every few steps I came to stalls where, for a small charge, you could dip a piece of bread in a cast-iron cauldron of melted cheese bubbling over a small brazier. I bought myself a sizable hunk of bread, dunked it liberally in melted cheese, wolfed it greedily, and washed it down with 2 mugs of lemonade. After many days of deprivation on the road, this massive intake of food and drink assuaged my hunger and thirst, as I'd hoped, but also occasioned an unwholesome feeling of repletion. This rather worried me for a while. I was afraid it might portend some incurable disease, until after walking off my meal for an hour or so, it vented itself in several ferocious expulsions of wind. What didn't I see on my walk? I continued to repress the urge to enter a bookshop rather than stagger along laden with a huge pile of volumes, but the most incredible treasures could be had for the most ridiculous prices. Where the Sea Wall Ends by Ectro Backwater, an autographed copy for 5 pyras. The Catacombs of Bookholm, a critically acclaimed account of conditions in the Bookholmian labyrinth by Colophonius Regenschein, the legendary book hunter, 3 pyras. A Bed of Nettles, the memoirs of Glumfrey Merk, the melancholy super-pessimist, 6 measly pyras. I was in a bibliophile's Elysium. There was no doubt about it. Even with the small sum Dancelot had left me, I could in no time have acquired a whole library that would have been the envy of everyone in Lindworm Castle. For the time being, however, I simply drifted along. Kibitzer's Warning. Once my wonderment at the bustle of activity in the streets had subsided a little, I began to resent being jostled by bloodums and pestered by itinerant hucksters. It was also growing steadily colder with the advent of darkness, so I resolved to start exploring the second-hand bookshops. But which? A large one with a varied stock? A small specialized establishment? If the latter, what should its speciality be? Poetry? Thrillers? Uglian horror stories? Grailsundian philosophy? Florenthian Baroque? With their candlelit windows full of literary titbits, all the shops looked equally tempting. For simplicity's sake, I plumped for the one I happened to be standing outside. Engraved on the door was a peculiar symbol, a circle divided into 3 by 3 curving lines inside it. The lighting was so subdued that I couldn't decipher the titles of the books displayed in the window, but that only made it seem the most mysterious and alluring establishment in the street. In I went. The discreet jangle of a bell announced my presence, the familiar scent of desiccated old tomes filled my nostrils, and for a moment I thought I was alone in the shop. My eyes took a while to become accustomed to the gloom, but then I saw a hump-backed figure with enormous goggle eyes emerge from the shadows cast by the bookcases. I heard a series of muffled, rhythmical clicks. "Can I help you?" the gnome inquired in a thin, reedy voice. He sounded as if his tongue was made of parchment. "Are you interested in the writings of Professor Abdul Nightingale?" Good heavens, I'd wound up in a shop specializing in the effusions of that crackpot from the Gloomberg Mountains. Nightingale, of all people! Although I wasn't too well acquainted with his work, I knew enough to know that his scientific view of the world was far removed from my own poetic conception of it. "Only superficially," I replied coolly, anxious to get out fast before natural courtesy prompted me to let the gnome foist one of Nightingale's unreadable tomes on me. "Superficiality implies a lack of profundity," he rejoined. "Perhaps you'd be interested in a secondary work devoted to Nightingale's scientific research into Zemonian labyrinthology. It's a fascinating treatise by Dr. Ostafan Colibri, one of his most gifted pupils. I'm not exaggerating when I say that it sheds considerable light on the decipherment of labyrinths in general." "I'm not particularly interested in labyrinths, to be honest," I said, backing away. "I fear I'm in the wrong shop." "Oh, aren't you interested in the sciences? You're looking for belles lettres? Escapist literature for refugees from reality? You're looking for novels? Then you have indeed come to the wrong address. I sell non-fiction only." There was no hostility or arrogance in his tone. He sounded politely informative, nothing more. I grasped the door handle. "Please forgive me," I said stupidly, turning it. "I'm new in this city." "You come from Lindworm Castle?" I stopped short. One of the invariable constants in the life of a dinosaur that walks on two legs is that everyone can tell his birthplace at a glance. I had yet to discover whether this was an advantage or a disadvantage. "I suppose that's obvious," I retorted. "Please forgive my somewhat derogatory generalization on the subject of fiction. I had to devise a few stock remarks designed to shake off the tourists who keep barging in and asking for signed first editions of the Prince Sans-Foix novels. Although this is a purely non-fiction establishment, I myself have devoured many a novel from Lindworm Castle." The dwarfish figure bent over a book-laden table and lit a candle. "And please forgive the subdued lighting. I think better in the dark." The ignited wick shed a dramatic light on the little creature's face. The flame danced nervously at first, then steadied and became less bright. The proprietor was a nocturnamouth. That I could tell without ever having seen one before. The shape of his cranium was unmistakable, as I knew from various encyclopedias, and indicated that he possessed at least 3 brains. I now realized that the mysterious clicks emanated from his skull. A nocturnamouth's thought processes are audible. "My name is Ahmed Ben Kibitzer." The nocturnamouth extended a bunch of twig-like fingers. I shook them gingerly. "I'm Optimus Yarnspinner," I said. "Have you published anything?" "Not yet." "In that case, you'll forgive me for not having read anything of yours." I laughed stiffly, feeling an utter fool. I was a literary nobody. "But, as I said, I've devoted a substantial proportion of my life to Lindwormian literature. My doctoral dissertation was an analysis of the effect of the poikilothermic circulation of dinosaurian authors on their stylistic concinnity." "Really?" I said, as if I knew what he was talking about. "And what conclusion did you come to?" "That a cold-blooded circulation can be quite compatible with stylistic harmony and elegance. Lindworms are born writers. I can prove it scientifically." "That's very flattering." "In fact," the gnome went on, "I'm of the opinion that, from the purely organic point of view, your species is positively made for writing. Your long lifespan is an important aid to mature craftsmanship, and your 3 claw-tipped fingers are ideal for gripping pen and pencil. As for your thick saurian hide, it's the finest protection against poor reviews." He tittered. "Lindworms have produced some of the finest novels in the history of Zermonian literature. One has only to think of The Ill-Starred Chamber by Sarto Iambicus, or Vapid Rhymesters, Drunk on Moonlight, or Hildia Playtanner's Blind Flamingo, Nocturnal Nonsense, Song of the Oyster, and Brittle Bait, not to mention Doylen Cohn's Sir Ginnell." "You've read Sir Ginnell?" "Most certainly. Do you remember the passage where the knight's monocle falls into his breastplate and he has to joust almost blind? Or where his lower jaw is dislocated by a blow from a mace, and he can only communicate in sign language for an entire chapter? How I laughed! A comic masterpiece." I hadn't got that far. I had tackled the boring old novel at Dancelot's insistence, but gave up after the first 100 pages. They were wholly devoted to the care and maintenance of the medieval lance, and hurled it into a corner. "Of course," I lied. "His lower jaw. An absolute scream." "You have to plough through the 100-page introduction devoted to the care and maintenance of the medieval lance," said Kibitzer. "But the author really gets going after that. Take the chapter in which he dispenses with the letter E for 150 pages, a brilliant feat of lipogrammatism. Remember Sir Ginnell's jovial little drinking song?" The Nocturnamith cleared his throat and quoted, "Come, landlord, fill again my glass, and fill again my dish. Those things apart, a buxom lass is all that I could wish." I gave a knowing smile. "Ah, yes," I said, "a stroke of genius. I hadn't got as far as that." "But forget about novels," exclaimed Kibitzer, who now had the bit between his teeth. "Lindworm Castle has also produced some excellent non-fiction. The Joys of Gardening, for instance, a milestone in the description of domesticated nature." I was taken aback. "You know Dancelot Wordwright?" I said, at last letting go of the door-handle. "Know him? You must be joking. I could quote him in my sleep. Thus, nature is our only solace. Almost instinctively we make our way out into the open air, out into our gardens. We breathe more freely, and our hearts grow lighter amid the rustle of the trees and beneath the stars. From the stars we come, to the stars we go. Life is but a journey into the unknown." This little Nocturnamith was better acquainted with Dancelot's work than I. A tear oozed from my left eye. "But I'm sure you share my admiration for him if a quotation from his work has such an emotional effect on you. That makes up for your ignorance of Sir Ginnell." I gave a start. Damnation! Nocturnamiths were mind-readers. I'd forgotten that. I resolved to be more careful what I thought about in future. "Thoughts cannot be suppressed like speech," Kibitzer said with a smile. "But there's no need to exert yourself. I already know so much about you, I can dispense with mind-reading. You're personally acquainted with Lancelot Wordwright, aren't you?" "He was my authorial godfather. He died recently." "Oh, really? Please forgive my insensitive question and accept my sincere condolences. The man was a genius." "Thank you. He himself would not have claimed as much." "That renders him doubly important. To possess the potential inherent in the joys of gardening, and then limit yourself to writing a single book. That is true greatness." If only Lancelot could have heard those words during his lifetime. More tears welled up in my eyes. "But do sit down. You must be tired out if you've come all the way from Lindworm Castle. Would you care for a cup of nutmeg coffee?" The antiquarian tottered over to a coffee-pot perched on a bookshelf. Quite suddenly, my limbs felt as heavy as lead. Having been on my feet since dawn, I'd scarcely rested at the hotel, and then roamed the streets for hours. His words made me realize how weary I was. I sat down on a chair and wiped the tears from my eyes. "Don't worry. I promise I won't delve into your thoughts any more," Kibitzer said as he handed me a temptingly aromatic cup of coffee. "May I, therefore, inquire in the traditional manner what brings you to Bookholm? My question isn't prompted by curiosity. I may be able to help you." He gave me a friendly smile. Perhaps a kindly providence had guided me to this shop, I thought. The Nocturnamith was by way of being a fan of Lancelot's writing, so why shouldn't I begin my quest with him? "I'm looking for an author." "Then Bookholm is definitely a better place to start than, say, the graveyard marshes of Dulsgard." Kibitzer's laugh at his own little joke sounded like an attack of asthma. I produced the manuscript. "Perhaps you'd read this. I'm looking for the person who wrote it. I don't know his name or what he looks like. I don't even know if he's still alive." "You're looking for a phantom?" The Nocturnamith grinned. "Very well, let me see." First, he checked the quality of the paper by rubbing it between finger and thumb, a procedure typical of his trade. High-grade Grelsundian wove," he muttered. "Timberlake paper mills, 200 grams. He sniffed the pages. "Slightly over-acidified. A peach tint. Birchwood with a hint of pine needles. The bleaching agent was insufficiently stirred. A trifle woody at the edges." This was the sort of antiquarian jargon I'd already heard on the lips of itinerant dealers in the streets. Kibitzer ran his forefinger along the edges of the sheets. "Unevenly trimmed. A nick every 5 millimeters at least. The guillotine was already obsolete, probably a thread-cutter dating from the century before last. The watermark was applied with cuttlefish ink, from which I infer that—
Perhaps you should read it? I ventured to suggest.
Eh?
Kibitzer seemed to awaken from a trance and stared at the first page for a long time. He was probably marveling, just as I had, at the manuscript's calligraphic beauty. At last he proceeded to read it. After a few moments he began to hum to himself like someone reading a score, as if I weren't there at all. He emitted several hoarse laughs, cried,
"Yes, yes, exactly,"
and made an extremely agitated impression. What followed might have been an imitation of my own response to the text at Lindworm Castle. He alternated abruptly between paroxysms of laughter and floods of tears, fought for breath, smote his brow with the flat of his hand, and gave vent to repeated cries of approval and delight.
"Yes, indeed! Yes! How true! It's so perfect!"
Then he lowered the manuscript and sat, staring into the gloom for several minutes, utterly motionless. I took the liberty of clearing my throat. Kibitzer gave a start and gazed at me with his big, glowing eyes. Their amber-colored irises were quivering. "Well?" I asked. "Do you know who the author is?"
"It's fantastic,"
he muttered. "I know. Whoever wrote it is a literary giant." Kibitzer handed the manuscript back, his eyes narrowing to slits. The whole shop seemed to grow darker.
"You must leave Bookholm," he whispered. "You're in mortal danger."
"What?"
"Kindly leave these premises. Return to Lindworm Castle at once. Go anywhere you like, but get out of the city at all costs. Don't stay at a hotel on any account. Show no one else this manuscript. No one. Understand? Destroy it. Make good your escape from Bookholm as soon as possible."
Every one of these recommendations was the diametrical opposite of what I really intended. In the first place, I should have liked to spend a little longer in the shop and chat with the kindly Nocturnamith. Secondly, I was delighted to have shaken the dust of Lindworm Castle off my feet, and was damned if I'd go back there so soon. Thirdly, I would naturally return to my hotel at some stage, because I'd left my things there. Fourthly, I had every intention of showing the manuscript to anyone who cared to read it. Fifthly, I would never, of course, destroy the most flawless piece of writing I'd ever set eyes on. And sixthly, I had no wish to leave this magnificent city, which promised to be the fulfillment of all my dreams. Before I could utter even one of my rejoinders, however, the gnome had hustled me out of the shop.
"Please take my advice,"
he whispered as he thrust me out of the door.
"Leave the city as soon as possible. Goodbye. No, farewell forever. Hurry, escape while you still can, and steer clear of the Triadic Circle."
Then he slammed the door, bolted it from the inside, and hung a closed sign in the window. The shop's interior became even darker than before. Colophonius Regenschein. I roamed the surrounding streets in a daze. Thanks to the homeless and exhausted condition in which I now found myself, dear readers, these emotional ups and downs had proved too much for me. First, the distressing reminder of Dancelot, then Kibitzer's hospitable reception, and finally his brusque dismissal. What an unrefined, weazened little prune of a fellow he was! I knew that antiquarian booksellers, and especially the Bookholmians among them, were given to eccentric behavior. Indeed, their professional reputation depended on it, so to speak. But what had Kibitzer meant when he told me to avoid the Triatic Circle? Had he been referring to the sign on his door? He was probably just an oddball afflicted by extreme mood swings, and no wonder if he persisted in reading Professor Abdul Nightingale's crack-brained writings. I strove to shake off my recollection of the incident by planning my future course of action. First, I needed to know more about this city and its unwritten laws. I needed a guidebook and a street map, even if such a thing existed, a printed list of the conventions to be observed when visiting antiquarian bookshops. It was possible that I had unwittingly broken certain rules peculiar to Bookholm. While debating these points, I recalled the shop window containing Colophonius Regenshine's Catacombs of Bookholm, a work that was said to plumb the city's mysteries. I resolved to acquire the book and digest its contents over a few cups of coffee in some well-heated cafe. By so doing, I could become an expert on Bookholm overnight and kill time without having to spend it in the dubious company of the White Bat and the rampaging Bloodums in the Golden Quill. I would collect my things in the morning and change hotels. It didn't take me long to find the bookshop again. The book was still in the window, so I paid the paltry sum it cost, bought a street map and antiquarian guide as well, and bore my acquisitions off to a nearby coffee shop. A nocturnal reading was in progress, which meant that every half-hour some wretched poet would mount a table and deliver a recitation for which he would, at Lindworm Castle, have been tarred, feathered, and hurled from the battlements. I stood marveling for a long time in front of a blackboard on which all the delicious fare one could order was listed in chalk. I was bewildered by the abundance of food and drink bearing names with literary associations. Printer's ink wine and blood and thunder coffee. Sweet paper sandwiches. They could be not only eaten but written on. Muse's Kiss cocoa, and Liquid Inspiration, the latter a brutally high-proof spirit. Horror candies, to be eaten while reading thrillers, many of them with surprise fillings of vinegar, cod-liver oil, or desiccated ants. And 17 types of pastries, named after various classical poets. For example, Bethelsia B. Bingro buns and Ardelf Nenito's cookies. Those in need of more substantial fare could gorge themselves on dishes named after popular novelists or their heroes, for instance, Prince Saint-Foy pie or risotto alla Evsko Dosti. But there was also a light syllabic salad incorporating alphabet spaghetti and trombophone mushrooms. It was enough to make your head spin. Having pulled myself together at last, I ordered a big jug of midnight oil espresso and a pastry known as a poet's ringlet. Then I retired to a table right beside the crackling stove in the furthest corner of the establishment. I took a swig of coffee and a bite of my delicious poet's ringlet, got out the Catacombs of Bookholm, and began to read. A dwarf with an unpleasantly shrill voice was reading out a long-winded essay on his aversion to sponges. Not that this impaired my concentration too much. If what I am reading has the power to grip me, I can read under the most difficult circumstances. And the Catacombs of Bookholm surpassed my expectations in every respect. The book was not only informative, but enthralling, and of a literary quality unusual in a work of non-fiction. After only a few paragraphs, the dwarf's frightful voice became mere background noise and little more intrusive than the twittering of a bird. Meanwhile, eager to plumb Bookholm's amazing mysteries,
I was descending into its hopelessly convoluted labyrinth of tunnels in the company of Colophonius Regenshine, the city's greatest book hunter and hero. Regenshine hadn't always been Bookholm's greatest book hunter, dear readers. Oh no, there had even been a time when his name wasn't Colophonius Regenshine at all. A resounding pseudonym was part of every book hunter's stock in trade, and Regenshine differentiated himself from his colleagues at the very outset by choosing one with no warlike connotations. His real name was Terran Trecco, and he was just a roaming vulphead whose travels had brought him to the city of dreaming books quite by chance. Indeed, literature had meant nothing to him at first. Like most vulpheads, Trecco possessed a prodigious memory and used that gift to earn a living in taverns by multiplying 100-digit numbers in his head while juggling with raw eggs. However, he happened to arrive in Bookholm just as a dispute broke out between the adherents of Druidical arithmetic and Old Zamonian mathematics. This divided the population of Zamonia into two irreconcilably hostile camps. The result was that mass brawls occurred nearly every time a memory artiste put on a show, so a vulphead had only to put his nose round a taproom door for the landlord to hurl a jug at him. Thus, Terran Trecco found himself threatened with starvation in the midst of a city filled with taverns, patronized by folk eager for entertainment, but he soon discovered a far more lucrative way of making money than performing numerical tricks for drunks, namely, dealing in rare books. This was no brilliant feat of deduction on his part, given that nearly everyone in Bookholm dealt in books. However, there existed some particularly rare specimens for which demand never waned. These were the books on the Golden List. The volumes on this list could not be purchased in any of the city's antiquarian bookshops. Very seldom offered for sale and promptly snapped up by wealthy collectors bidding in competition, they were literary legends coveted by all, rather like the gigantic diamond, reputed to lie hidden in the heart of Lindworm Castle. One particular type of adventurers, they were known as book hunters, had specialized in running these precious works to earth in the bowels of Bookholm and bringing them to the surface. Many book hunters were hired by collectors or dealers, others went prospecting on their own account. The sums offered for volumes on the Golden List were so astronomical that a single specimen could make a book hunter wealthy for life. It was a dangerous occupation, the most dangerous in all Bookholm. You, my courageous readers, may conceive of going in search of some book as an antiquarian's boring spare-time hobby, but here, in the depths of this mysterious city, it was more perilous than hunting crystalloscorpions in the glass grottos of Demon Range. Why? Because the catacombs of Bookholm teemed with dangers of a very special kind. The labyrinthine tunnels were said to be connected to Netherworld, the mysterious realm of evil reputed to extend beneath the whole of Zamonia. According to Colophonius Regenshine, however, the dangers lurking in the darkness below the city were real and lethal enough to be able to dispense with the support of old wives' tales. It is impossible to ascertain precisely when the very first book hunters descended into the darkness, but the assumption is that it must have been roughly when professional antiquarianism first became established in the city. Bookholm had been the center of the Zamonian book trade for many hundreds, indeed thousands of years, from the time when the first handwritten volumes appeared to the present age of mass production. It was discovered at a very early stage that the catacombs' dry atmosphere rendered them ideal places in which to store paper. Whole national libraries were deposited in them. This was where princes hid their literary treasures, book pirates their booty, dealers their first editions, and publishers their stocks. Bookholm wasn't really a city at first.
It existed almost entirely below ground in the form of inhabited caves, linked ever more closely by artificial tunnels, shafts, galleries, and stairways, and occupied by tribes and communities of the most diverse life forms. All that existed on the surface were the mouths of the caves and a few huts. From these, the city continued to develop above ground until it attained its present size. There was a wild and anarchic period in Bookholm's history, a time devoid of law and order, during which raids and forays, mayhem, murder, and thoroughgoing wars were of daily occurrence below ground. The catacombs were ruled by warlike princes and ruthless book pirates who fought to the death and were forever wresting literary treasures away from each other. Books were carried off and concealed in the ground, whole collections deliberately buried by their owners to hide them from the pirates. Wealthy dealers had themselves mummified after death and entombed with their literary gems. There were one or two valuable books for the sake of which whole sections of the catacombs were converted into death traps with converging walls, spear-lined pitfalls, and spring-operated blades capable of transfixing or beheading incautious thieves. Intruders who activated a tripwire might instantly flood a tunnel with water or acid, or be crushed to death by falling beams. Other tunnels were purposely infested with dangerous insects and animals that bred unchecked, rendering the catacombs more hazardous still. The Bookhamists, a secret society of antiquarians with alchemistic tendencies, celebrated their grisly rites down below. It was believed that the so-called hazardous books originated during this lawless period. All of the catacombs' rational inhabitants were driven from them by the epidemics and natural disasters, earthquakes and subterranean volcanic eruptions that followed, and only the toughest and most stubborn remained behind. This marked the true beginning of civilized life in the city and the birth of Bookholm's professional antiquarianism. Many treasures were brought to the surface, bookshops and dwellings arose, guilds were founded, laws enacted, crimes prescribed, and taxes raised. Some of the entrances to the subterranean world were built over, and others bricked up. Those that remained were sealed off with doors and manhole covers, and rigorously guarded. From then on, only those parts of the catacombs that had been surveyed, mapped, and pronounced safe could be entered, and then only by dealers who had obtained licenses granting them access to the areas in question. They were entitled to exploit licensed tunnels and sell any books they found there. They were also at liberty to explore deeper levels, but it was not long before none of them ventured to do so after the boldest of their number had either returned more dead than alive, or failed to return at all. This was how the first book hunters appeared on the scene. They were audacious adventurers who had been commissioned by dealers or collectors to find rare books for them. Although no golden list existed at this time, legends arose concerning very rare items. The book hunters began by looking for scarce and valuable works at random, often proceeding on the simple assumption that a book was older and more valuable the deeper it was located. Most of them were uncouth, insensitive souls, ex-mercenaries or criminals with little knowledge of literature and antiquarianism. In fact, some couldn't even read. Their principal qualification was an absence of fear. Then, as now, the book hunter's trade was governed by a few simple laws. Since those who had entered the catacombs could never be certain whether or where they would emerge, the following rule applied. The bookseller, via whose premises book hunters regained the surface, was entitled to sell their haul and retain 10% of the proceeds. Another 10% went to the Zamonian exchequer, and the lion's share to the book hunters themselves. It was, however, an open secret that they also used other illegal routes, sewers, ventilation shafts, or tunnels of their own, and sold their booty on the black market. As time went by, the book hunters developed various methods of finding their way back to the surface. They marked bookshelves with chalk, unreeled balls of twine behind them, or laid trails of confetti, rice, glass beads, or pebbles. They drew primitive maps and illuminated many stretches of tunnel with lamps in which phosphorescent jellyfish were immersed in nutrient fluid. They staked out their territories, hewed springs of drinking water out of the living rock, and established supply depots. It might be said that, in their own modest way, they brought a touch of civilization to the catacombs of Bookholm. For all that, book hunting remained a hazardous form of livelihood. Successive generations of book hunters had to conquer new areas of the catacombs, and the deeper they went, the greater the dangers became. Their work was made no easier by hitherto unknown life forms, huge insects, winged bloodsuckers, volcanic worms, fanged beetles, and poisonous snakes. But every book hunter's most dangerous foe continued to be his own kind. The rarer the really valuable books became, the fiercer the competition for them. Where book hunters had once been able to help themselves to a superabundance of literary treasures, several of them would now go hunting for the same long-lost library or the same rare item on the golden list. This often triggered a cutthroat contest of which there could be only one winner. The catacombs of Bookholm were strewn with the skeletons of book hunters, with axes embedded in their bleached skulls. The more refined manners became in the city overhead, the cruder and more brutal they became in the world beneath. In the end, a permanent state of war prevailed there, a lawless, merciless conflict of each against all. Terran Treco could not have chosen a less favorable moment to assume the professional name Colophonius Regenshine and become a book hunter. He was, in fact, the first of his kind to become one. Being a Vulped, he was positively predestined for that profession. Vulpeds are tough and in prime physical condition. They possess excellent powers of recall, an above-average sense of direction, and a wealth of imagination. Most book hunters were distinguished by their fearlessness and brutality alone, whereas Regenshine brought a new attribute into play, his intelligence. He found it harder than they did to master his fears, was not as strong and ruthless, and did not possess the same criminal energy. But he did have a well-laid plan and was determined to become the most successful book hunter of all time. In this respect, his phenomenal memory would prove to be his most important asset. While still living on charity, and, as he himself confessed, on petty theft and stolen food, he acquired the knowledge he deemed indispensable to his aims by spending long hours in the municipal library and numerous bookshops. He learnt dozens of ancient languages, memorized old maps of Bookholm's underworld, and combined the information he gleaned into a grand plan of action. He studied the history of book manufacture, from the handwritten manuscript to the modern printed volume, and found temporary employment at a printing works and a paper mill. He learnt to distinguish between different papers and inks blindfolded, so as to be able to identify them by touch and smell in total darkness. He attended lectures on geology, archaeology, and mining at Bookholm University, studied books on subterranean flora and fauna, and made a note of which of the catacombs' plants, fungi, sponges, reptiles, and insects were edible and which poisonous, which harmless and which dangerous. He learnt how to stave off starvation for days by chewing certain roots, how to recognize the most nutritious species of worms and catch them, and how to detect veins of drinking water in the rock by means of geological features. Next, Regenshine became apprenticed to one of Bookholm's ex-libris perfumers. This was a profession unique to the city. For hundreds of years, wealthy collectors had made a practice of impregnating their books with perfumes manufactured to order.
This lent their treasures an olfactory stamp of ownership, an aromatic ex libris that was not only detectable and unmistakable even in the dark, but invaluable to anyone concealing his books beneath the surface. Colophonius Regenschein was equipped with a good sense of smell. Although vulpeds' noses are not as sensitive as those of Volpertings or even of dogs, because their canine instincts and faculties have atrophied over the generations, they can nonetheless recognize olfactory nuances undetectable by other Zammonian life forms. Regenschein sniffed his way through the whole library of scents belonging to Olfactorio de Papyrus, an ex-libris perfumer whose family business had helped to endow legendary collections and rare volumes with their unique fragrances for many generations. He memorized the books' titles and their authors' names, the details of where and when they had disappeared, and any other particulars about them he could find. He sniffed leather and paper, linen and pasteboard, and learnt how these different materials reacted to being steeped in lemon juice, rosewater, and hundreds of other aromatic essences. The smoked cookbooks published by the Saffron Press, the balm-scented manuscripts of the naturopath Dr. Greenfinger, the pine-needle pamphlets of the Folier period, Prince Zaan of Florence autobiography rubbed with almond kernels, the Rickshaw Demon's Curry Book, the ethereal library of Mad Prince Ognagog. Colophonius Regenschein became acquainted with every book perfume ever made. He learnt that books could smell of soil, snow, tomatoes, seaweed, fish, cinnamon, honey, wet fur, dried grass, and charred wood, and he also learnt how these odors could change over the centuries, mingling with the aromas of the catacombs to such an extent that they often underwent a complete transformation. In addition to this, of course, Regenschein studied Zammonian literature. He read everything that came his way, whether novel, poem, or essay, play script, biography, or collection of letters. He became a walking encyclopedia. Every last corner of his memory was crammed with texts and particulars relating to Zammonian creative writing and the life and works of the most varied authors. Colophonius Regenschein trained his body as well as his mind. He developed a breathing technique that enabled him to survive even in the most airless conditions. He also went on a slimming diet that reduced his weight sufficiently for him to squeeze through the narrowest of passages and fissures in the rock. In the end, when he felt thoroughly qualified to embark on a career as a book hunter, he decided to do so with a bang that would be heard all over Bookholm. He did not choose any old bookshop for his first excursion, nor did he set off on an aimless quest. No, he turned his expedition into a venture that evoked scornful accusations of megalomania from everyone in the city. Through the medium of the live newspapers, he announced exactly when and where he would descend into the catacombs, and when and where he would reappear on the surface. He also gave advance notice of the 3 books he intended to unearth. Princess Daintyhoof, the only surviving signed first edition of Hermofink's legendary account of how the Volpertings originated, bound in nern leaves. Treatise on Cannibalism, an account of the customs and conventions of Mad Prince Ognagog's cadaverous cannibals by Orlog Gu, who was devoured by his objects of study on completing the book. And the 12,000 Precepts, the bookimist's abstruse list of rules, possibly the most scandalous book in the whole of Zammonia. Regenschein's announcement was somewhat presumptuous, given that the 3 books in question had for many years been regarded as lost, and stood high on the golden list, so even one of them would have made its discoverer wealthy. Last but not least, Regenschein further announced, doubtless so as to render his venture more spectacular still, that he would publicly commit suicide if he failed to bring the above-named works to the surface within a week. Everyone in Bookholm agreed that the Vulphead had lost his wits.
It was thought absolutely impossible to do what no other book hunter had succeeded in doing over the years, namely, to snaffle 3 golden list books at once, let alone to do so within the space of a single week. Amid roars of sarcastic laughter from a large crowd of spectators, the audacious Vulp had descended into the catacombs of Bookholm at the appointed hour. Bets were laid against his chances of success as the week went by. On the predicted day, a vast crowd assembled round the bookshop from which he proposed to emerge after regaining the surface. Just before noon, Colophonius Regenstein staggered out of the main entrance and into the street. Sodden from head to foot with blood, he had an iron arrow protruding from his right shoulder and was carrying 3 books under his arm. Princess Daintyhoof, Treatise on Cannibalism, and the 12,000 Precepts. He smiled, waved to the marveling crowd, and collapsed unconscious. In the next chapter of his book, Regenstein described in every detail how he had planned this expedition, made long-term preparations for it, and finally carried it out. He had begun by combining numerous descriptions of various parts of the catacombs into a complete mental picture of their layout. Then he assembled all the facts he had learnt while studying the 3 books he was after. He knew exactly when they had been printed, who had printed them, and the addresses of the bookshops that had taken delivery of the first editions. Next, he traced their subsequent history with the aid of documentary records. He discovered that part of the first printing had been destroyed by a big fire, that some salvaged copies had been sold to another bookshop, that unsaleable stocks had been pulped, that individual copies had survived, and so on and so forth. He knew from diaries, letters, and publishers' financial accounts how well or badly the books had sold and why, and where they had been consigned to the rubbish dump. The same sources yielded other useful items of information, for instance, that a copy of the first edition of Princess Daintyhoof had turned up in the window of a certain bookshop, that it had eventually fetched an immense sum at auction, and that it had disappeared after the purchaser had been robbed on the way home. Regenstein discovered that the putative thief, a celebrated book pirate whose sobriquet was Gory Hands, had been walled up alive by a fellow criminal named Blore the Bricklayer. While examining the latter's papers, he further discovered a map on which Blore had marked all the places where he had stored his victims complete with their possessions. Once in the catacombs, Colophonius Regenstein was greatly assisted by his study of Zamonian literary history and book printing. He could classify every author and literary school, knew which antiquarian booksellers devoted themselves to certain writers or specialized fields, and could determine from a book's binding and the condition of its spine which edition it belonged to, when this had been published, and how many copies had been printed. Regenstein had no need to ferret systematically through each stack of volumes like other book hunters. Armed with his jellyfish lamp, he had only to hurry along the passages, glancing swiftly to left and right. He even derived valuable information from the order in which various subterranean collections had been stored, and this guided him to the treasures he was seeking. His apprenticeship with the ex-libris perfumer now paid off. One sniff sufficed to tell him that a whole roomful of books had once belonged to a collector who had imbued all his volumes with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Regenstein could tell for sure that the copy of Princess Daintyhoof he sought was not among them, because it had belonged to an eccentric with such an insane love of cats that he impregnated his entire collection with the unpleasant odor of feline urine. A less proficient book hunter would now have gone sniffing for this everywhere, but Regenstein knew that the olfactory components of cat's piss took on the unique and penetrating smell of rotting seaweed after a century at most underground. When he was at last confronted by a time-worn brick wall in the depths of the catacombs and detected a smell of the sea, he knew that he had found his first book. Where the 12,000 Precepts was concerned, Regenschein's study of literary history had acquainted him with the year in which it had been banned and burnt by the Atlantean Vice Squad. As always in such cases, one copy had been ceremoniously conveyed into the catacombs and walled up there. Discovered by book hunters a century later, it changed hands several times before being destroyed by a bookshop fire. Or so the authorities claimed. Regenschein, who had scoured the municipal records for that year, came across a bankruptcy petition lodged by the dealer who had owned the relevant bookshop. Further research in Bookholm's municipal library had enabled him to unearth the diary of the dealer's wife, in which she confessed that her husband had torched the shop himself and hidden his most valuable books in the catacombs. Having helped him to make away with them, she was able to give a precise description of their whereabouts. Regenschein found the treatise on cannibalism by employing a similar process of detection. However, dear readers, I will spare you a full account of this, and confine myself to saying that it entailed a detailed knowledge of paper manufacture in ancient times, of the microscopic technique required to cast lead type for footnotes, of the decline of Ornean isosyllabism during Zemonia's singing wars, and the preservation of goatskin covers by means of linseed oil. In short, Colophonius Regenschein found the books he was after even before the appointed week had elapsed, or within 3 days, so he had to stick it out in the catacombs for the remaining 4 in order to meet his self-imposed deadline exactly. When he finally made for the surface, he was attacked by another book hunter. As I already mentioned, the only professional qualification Regenschein lacked was the criminal initiative possessed by his colleagues. He simply hadn't considered the possibility that someone might try to rob him of his haul. That someone was Ronkonkoma, Bookholm's most notorious and dangerous book hunter, an evil individual who owed all his successes to the fact that he never went looking for rare books himself, but stole them from others on principle. Having learnt of Regenschein's grandiloquent announcement, he lay in wait beneath the bookshop from which his prospective victim was due to emerge. That was all he had to do, apart from spearing Regenschein in the back with an iron javelin. Fortunately for Regenschein, Ronkonkoma missed his heart and merely pierced his shoulder. A ferocious duel ensued. Although unarmed, Regenschein managed to inflict so many wounds on Koma with his canine teeth that the rapacious book hunter lost a great deal of blood and took to his heels, but not without swearing eternal enmity. The Vulp had only just made it to the surface before passing out, and did not regain consciousness for a week. He had lived up to his ambitious predictions, however, and the live newspapers were quick to spread the word. Overnight, Colophonius Regenschein had become the most famous book hunter of all. He could also have become the best-paid book hunter of all, because collectors and dealers bombarded him with offers, but Regenschein turned them all down. Although he resumed book hunting when he had recuperated, this time armed and forever on his guard against Ronkonkoma, he kept most of the books he acquired for himself. His ultimate intention soon became clear. Colophonius Regenschein aimed to collect 1 copy of every last book on the Golden List. He managed to do this in an incredibly short space of time, and he also returned to the surface laden with other books which, although not on the list, were valuable in the extreme. These he sold, using the proceeds to purchase one of the handsomest old buildings in Bookholm, where he set up the Library of the Golden List as a place in which rare works could be studied under supervision for scholarly purposes. Colophonius Regenschein thus became Bookholm's greatest hero, a combination of adventurer, patron, and paragon. Despite his wealth and fame, however, and although his expeditions became ever more hazardous, Regenstein could not resist the lure of the catacombs. He was as hated down there as he was popular in the world above. Some of the most brutal book hunters dogged his footsteps and tried to steal his finds. They included Nassim Gandari, nicknamed the Noose because he crept up behind his victims and garroted them with cheese wire. Imran the Invisible, so called because he was thin enough to be mistaken in the dark for a pit prop until you were suddenly transfixed by a poisoned arrow from his blowpipe. Reverberous Echo, whose talent for vocal and acoustic mimicry led his victims astray and lured them into death traps, after which he cannibalized them to cover his tracks. And Lembo the Snake Cecani, a book hunter who had sunk so low, morally speaking, that he wriggled along on his belly camouflaged in manuscripts, as supple and attenuated as his nickname implied. Tariq Tabari, Hunk Hogno, Herman de Griswold, Hadwin Paxi, Aslif Kehesmu, Horgul the Hairless, Blondie Snotsniff, the Toto twins. Colophonius Regenstein became involuntarily acquainted with all of these book hunters, and several more besides, but none of them managed to rob him of a single book, and most sustained severe injuries in the course of their encounters with him. Some abandoned the profession, and others steered well clear of him in the future. Only one repeatedly and deliberately challenged his supremacy, Rong Kong Koma the Terrible. The most fearsome of all book hunters lay in wait for Regenstein again and again, doggedly thirsting for revenge, and the two of them fought almost a dozen strenuous duels from which neither emerged a clear winner, usually because they broke off hostilities by reason of exhaustion. One such confrontation mentioned by Regenstein was a crossbow duel after which, riddled with poisoned arrows, he just managed to reach the safety of the bookshop owned by Ahmed ben Kibitzer, who nursed him back to health. I'm sure, dear readers, that you can imagine how astonished I was, while reading Regenstein's book, to come across the name of the crotchety little nocturnamith who had tried to send me packing. But book hunters weren't the only danger that lurked beneath Bookholm. No one had ever descended as far into the catacombs as Colophonius Regenstein, and no one had set eyes on as many of its marvels and monstrosities. He wrote of miles-deep caverns filled with millions of ancient volumes in the process of being devoured by phosphorescent worms and moths. He wrote of tunnels infested with blind and transparent insects that hunted anything within reach of their yards-long antennae. Of frightful winged creatures, he called them harpiers, whose frightful screams had almost robbed him of his sanity on one occasion. Of the rusty gnomes' bookway, an immense subterranean railroad system said to have been constructed thousands of years ago by a dwarfish race of very skillful craftsmen. He also told of Unholm, the catacombs' gigantic rubbish dump where millions of books lay mouldering away. Regenstein firmly believed in the existence of the fearsome booklings, a race of one-eyed creatures dwelling deep in the bowels of Bookholm and reputed to devour alive anything that came their way. He even entertained no doubts about the popular myth of a race of giants, said to have lived in the deepest and biggest of all the subterranean caverns where they stoked Zamonia's volcanoes. He had seen so many incredible sights in the catacombs that he regarded nothing, absolutely nothing, as being beyond the bounds of possibility. Although his book had been accused of transgressing the frontier between truth and fiction, it did so in such a subtle way that I didn't care which page I was on. Regenstein's writing utterly enthralled me. I devoured chapter after chapter as Bookholm's night-life raged around me, pausing only occasionally to signal for another pot of coffee before avidly reading on. Alas, dear readers, I cannot possibly summarize all the details Regenshine disclosed about the world beneath my feet. There were simply too many of them. I will, however, make mention of one chapter, for it was in that one, the last of all, that Regenshine's book really took off. It was devoted to the Shadow King. The story of the Shadow King was one of the more recent legends, only a few score years old, about the Bookholmian underworld. It told of the birth of a being said to have established a reign of terror in the catacombs far surpassing any of the book hunter's atrocities. The legend went as follows. Many shadows exist in the gloom of the catacombs. Shadows of living creatures, of dead things, of vermin that creep, crawl, and fly, of book hunters, of stalagmites and stalactites. A multifarious race of silhouettes dancing restlessly over the tunnel roofs and book-lined walls. They strike terror into many intruders, or drive them insane. One day, in the not-too-distant past, so legend had it, these incorporeal beings grew tired of their anarchic living conditions and elected a leader. They superimposed one shadow, one silhouette, one shade of darkness on another until all these became amalgamated into a demi-creature. Half alive and half dead, half solid and half insubstantial, half visible and half invisible, he became their ruler and spiritual executor. In other words, the Shadow King. This was only the popular version of the legend, for there were several different theories about who or what the Shadow King really was. Book hunters claimed he was the wrathful spirit of the dreaming books, their incarnate anger at having been forgotten and buried in the catacombs. They believed that this spirit had come to wreak revenge on all living creatures, and that he dwelt in a subterranean abode named Shadow Hall Castle. Such was the book hunter's version. Those booksellers who still ventured some distance into the catacombs asserted that the Shadow King was nothing more than a monstrous parasite, a cross between an insect and a bat produced by the labyrinth's unwholesome atmosphere, and that its sole aim was to destroy their precious books. Such was the bookseller's version. Scientists, on the other hand, endeavored to prove that the Shadow King was a very ancient life form that had finally made its way upwards from the nether regions of the cave system. Far from pursuing a definite objective, they declared, it blindly followed its animal instincts and attacked anything it encountered because it needed sustenance. Such was the scientists' version. The Ooglies believed that the Shadow King would spell the end of Bookholm. They predicted that he would unleash a catastrophe so immense and all-encompassing that it would wipe the city from the face of the earth. Such was the Ooglies' version. The children of Bookholm, by contrast, were convinced that the Shadow King was an evil spirit that made horrific noises in their clothes cupboards at night. Such was the demon-in-the-wardrobe version. The one point on which all agreed was that the Shadow King really existed. Whatever he was, whether phantom, animal, or monster, many had heard him, some had been hunted by him, and a few even killed by him. Those who had heard him likened his voice to the rustle of a book's pages fluttering in the wind. As for those who had seen him, they were now dead. Many a book hunter's blood-stained and horribly mutilated corpse had been found, often with tiny pieces of paper lodged in the hundreds of cuts inflicted on it. The popular explanation of this phenomenon was that the Shadow King slew his victims with a weapon made of paper, possibly with one of the so-called hazardous books. And sometimes, on exceptionally windless nights, the whole of Bookholm could hear his spine-chilling howls rising from the depths. Colophonius Regenshine, too, was firmly convinced of the Shadow King's existence, but not, like most other people, of his fundamentally evil disposition. He even believed that this mysterious creature had once saved his life when he fell into a trap laid for him by Rong Kong Koma. The latter had meant to crush him to death beneath a huge bookcase, but someone had thrust the massive piece of furniture aside before it could land on him. Although Regenshine's savior had disappeared by the time he scrambled to his feet unscathed, he felt sure it was the Shadow King. He had been obsessed with this living legend ever since. He aimed to prove his theory that the Shadow King was an intelligent, benevolent being, not savage and malign, by hunting and capturing him, but not in order to kill him or put him on show. He wanted to gain the Shadow King's friendship, and then release him. Regenshine had part of his house converted into a barred enclosure, got up to resemble the catacombs, complete with subdued jellyfish lighting and book-lined walls. He believed that the Shadow King would feel at home there and become habituated to overworld, and one day, when he had been submitted to thorough scientific research, he would be granted his freedom. In the last few pages of his book, Regenshine described his preparations for the expedition and announced his intention of writing a sequel documenting his quest for the Shadow King. His research had led him to contact a collector and literary scholar named Fistamel Smike, who was reputed to have an extensive knowledge of the legends about the Shadow King and the books devoted to him. An acknowledged expert, Smike was so taken with Regenshine's project that he helped him as much as he could and invested some of his own money in it. It was Fistamel Smike's old house in the heart of the city from which Colophonius Regenshine was said to have set off on his expedition into the catacombs. But the final words in the Catacombs of Bookholm had been written by his publisher. He appended a melancholy postscript in which he reported that Colophonius Regenshine's descent into the catacombs from the home of Fistamel Smike was the last occasion on which the greatest of all book hunters had been seen. Sad to relate, my intrepid readers, his quest for the Shadow King was a venture from which he never returned.